Hello, my name's Todd. I am a web developer at the Washington Post. I am not in DC, obviously, so I work remotely. I'm actually a little bit crestfallen. So when Joe and I were talking about a talk to do, and said that we're doing this React series and we want to do some stuff to sort of prep people who don't do a lot of React to sort of be able to get into React quickly. He mentioned array methods, and Steve and I were talking before my talk. Mark, who's usually here, the
boisterous,
burly, boisterous Englishman from Yorkshire, was giving crap to people about why should we use these array methods. And so most of this talk is really, like, the fact that you'll learn something is really secondary. The primary goal of this talk was to troll Mark. And then of course he didn't show up. So I'll have to send him a link or something. Also, I didn't really have a title for the talk. I just needed a good excuse to use Captain Marvel because she's awesome. So why and this is not about all array methods, by the way. This is about like the 3 or 4 that you're going to use most frequently when you do a lot of React development. So why use them? They quickly convey intent. So one of the things that came up a couple months ago, and I'll get into this a little bit more as we go, but was why use these fancy array methods? You could just use a for loop or a while loop or any kind of like dinosaur patterns that we've used for years. And I think one of the great things about these array methods is they very quickly convey intent. So and intent to me is crucial. There's the canonical Martin Fowler quote that any idiot can write code that a computer can understand. Good programmers write code that humans can understand. And so if you're reading code and you see a map, you should have a pretty good idea that it's transforming the elements of that array. If you see a reduce, it's going to be a little bit more opaque, but it's generally reducing the array down to some value, whether it's an object or an array or a number. So they very quickly convey intent in your code. They provide immutability. So I'm not personally a functional programmer, but I am someone who has a OOP, C# background before I got really into JavaScript. I don't do that anymore because I don't like it anymore. But I love JavaScript, and one of the things that's gotten really big over the last couple of years in the JavaScript community is immutability and functional programming. And personally, I believe all things being equal, and all things are rarely equal when you're writing code, but generally all things being equal, we should prefer immutability. Those of us who have an OOP background know the pain of some value hidden in a class/object somewhere that gets mutated and you have a bug in production. That's not fun. And so immutability gives you ways to sort of bypass those side effects. And a lot of these array methods, at least the ones I'm highlighting tonight, basically are immutable. And as Joe mentioned, this is a sort of a prerequisite for some React learning over the next however many months. And React has something called JSX, some of you may know. Those of you who are not React developers, JSX is basically the templating language within React. And you can't do, I always get this confused, Joe. You can do expressions in a JSX curly, but you can't do statements or I always get that.
There's no ifs.
Yeah, there's no ifs. You can't do a for loop in it. You could call a function that does a for loop that returns something, but you can't directly do if statements or for loops or while loops or any of those kinds of things. So let's talk about map. And all of these, I think I explicitly put array.prototype.whatever, just to let you know that these are things you get out of the box because they're on the prototype of an array. So anytime you have an array, you get these out of the box. Contrary to what people who think that these array methods are like fancy new things that all the hipster kids are doing, ES5. Map has been around since ES5. It may have even been in like an earlier draft than ES5. So it's not like it's some ES6 thing, although ES6 is what, 3 or 4 years old now? map returns an array of this is the way I think of it, and map can actually do a lot more, but I generally like to think of it as something that, a method that it takes a callback and it returns an array of, a new array, which is sort of part of that immutability theme of transformed elements. And I think it's probably the most, at least in my experience, it's the most used array method in React because it's so directly usable. And I'll show you, we're going to get to some code right now. The Todd rule of a presentation is code as fast as you can get to it. That in React, you often use map to dynamically generate components. So I'm jumping ahead too far. So now let's go to some code. So let's do like a really basic map. So mapped array. And let's just do the most simple sort of canonical thing here. Right, and so I'm calling map, and I get it up out of the box because I have an array, and map is on the array prototype. Chris, by the way, who just did a talk, gave a great talk about prototypes. You should be able to find that in the NWCJS YouTube library, right? So, and as you see in our little VS Code thing, it gives you even some types and whatnot about the arguments that the map method takes. And so we're just going to go through this, and we get a first param to this callback that we just get from map, and it's going to be whatever element is in that current iteration. So that I'm going to say iteration a lot in this talk. And we're just going to do, so as I mentioned, map transforms. So let's say we're going to like triple all of these numbers. Right, so then let's log that array. Let's run it. And we get these tripled. So it just went through, and your map is going to be as long as the array. It's going to iterate through every element of the array, sort of line array that I created. And it's just going to triple each of them. That's my talk. Thank you, everybody. Very exciting, huh? Before I get into React, probably the most common use case I had for map was you call an API and you get some data back from the API. And then that data is very likely going to be an array of items, and there's going to be like this data object. And so let me just walk you through this very quickly. So we get a result, and like you do from an endpoint, you get an object, and then that object has some properties, and it's usually a data property. And so this data property is an array that has, so this was one of my mark things, because I'm also a big English football fan, also known as soccer. And so all of these are very heavy soccer references. So this is going to be an array of objects that represent a football club. And so all we're really going to do is basically cycle through this array, and we're just going to pull out this name, right? So it does that, and it just pulls out the club name. Right? So super exciting. This, by the way, is something we could also do. Not comment this. Could do it in a for loop. Right, and it does the exact same thing. And so one of the things that people will bring up about map and reduce is, what about performance? And I would say, first of all, before I get into the actual perf, especially because this is React theme, I don't know that I haven't run into an issue where I was mapping so many items that I had to do a for loop. If you have like 5,000 components that you're rendering, you might want to rethink the way you're approaching React and your front-end architecture. But there are always strange use cases in technology. So if you do run into that situation, you could just do a for loop and extract it to a function. That's not really what this talk is about. So I did run perfs. There's this test called, or this site called JSPerf, and it runs like bits of code, and it gives you performance metrics on that. So as you see, I don't know if you can see all of these. It doesn't really matter, but a simple for loop is definitely a lot faster. A map is 74% slower than this simple for loop, but also for each. So anybody who says, I don't like map, I'll use for each is actually slower in all three of these tests, and each test has a sample size of I don't know, 60 runs that it does. But why? So what is map doing under the covers? I don't know if you can see this. It's not really that important that you see it. But this is the MDN polyfill. So if you're in some kind of environment, if you're doing IE6, IE5, whatever, didn't support IE3, maybe didn't support ES5, and you needed a polyfill map. This was their polyfill, and it also I also found this exact code in ES spec. So I assume this is essentially what it's doing under the covers. Map does some checks and a while loop under the covers. So I don't know, maybe is it slower because it's doing a while loop versus a for loop? So I ran some perf on that, and it actually turns out that a while loop, I never knew this, a while loop is actually fastest of all of these. So a while loop is faster than a for loop, although anybody programming for more than a few years knows that a while loop is a great way to do an infinite loop. You get caught in it. Joe's done it. You get caught in an infinite loop because your while condition was not very good. So my guess, to give an answer, I don't have an exact answer, but the while loop is all the way over here, and there's all this other stuff where it does some checks on the callback and the args it gets. My guess is that map is slower because it does all of these checks before it even does the loop. So with that, let's talk about usage in React. And for those of you who don't know React, don't get worried about this. I'm going to use some terms, but it's sometimes good to hear something you don't know so that when it comes up, you're like, oh, I've already heard about that. Map is used, as I said before, it's generally used anytime you need to dynamically generate components. So if you have like actually have an example of like an investing app, and you've got a watch list, and it comes up on your phone, and you scroll through, and each one of those like stock quotes is a component that you're probably generating that dynamically. Another very, very common one is option tags in a select/dropdown. Or like a type ahead or something like that, where you're doing a fetch and you need to fetch through the data, although you could probably get it from cache instead of an API, but you'd still be mapping through it. So you map through those options, and I'll show you that in some code in a select. And also, as I showed you before, fetches, it's very helpful. There are some gotchas with JSX. There's this thing, React needs a key. I don't really think it gives you errors anymore on this. I thought in the past I've gotten errors.
I think it depends on.
Does it depend on your context?
It could be your ESLint settings, but you definitely get a warning now.
Yeah, you definitely get a warning. It's just I thought in the past I'd gotten some errors, and then I did some in these. So
I don't know that it's a non-fatal error.
Yeah, apparently it's just a warning. So here I have this thing with this super lovely, where's Megan? Megan, don't look at my nav bar here. Megan's a designer. And I have this horrible looking nav bar. Partly it looks bad so that you notice it. And that's also an excuse for my terrible design.
Looks very accessible and responsive.
Yes,
would be my guess.
yes, it is.
You do find that just HTML is pretty friggin' responsive.
Right.
Just.
So this is super simple. So you go in and you choose a club. This was also to troll Mark since he's not here. This is the French national team winning the World Cup last summer. Very upsetting for the English and the French, if you don't know. They have a bit of a history. And so you'd go through and you'd choose, I'm a Chelsea supporter, so obviously I'm always going to choose that one. Good. Oh, I will.
I will send it to Mark.
I will.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, he'll like this even more. So Mark's club is Newcastle United. So I put in this little thing that. So for these others, if you. Oh, and this is Manchester United, who I hate. A buddy of mine's a Liverpool supporter. He ingrained hatred of Man United in me. So you hit reset club, and it takes you to the French national team. I'll pause for Joe to get a picture and
All right, you
tweet
throw
Mark.
up a middle finger. Thank you very much.
But the best part is if you go to Newcastle, which is Mark's club, and you hit reset club, it gives you the Newcastle badge. And Newcastle, it's the Tyne-Wear Derby, so Newcastle and Sunderland hate each other. Apparently it goes even back to like the English Civil War and the War of the Roses. So it's a deep hatred. So this was the one, I'm actually kind of glad Mark's not here because he may have actually like rushed me at this point. He would have tired of me. But anyway, so there's that. So back on so here's that lovely nav bar that I showed you. Let me bring this up a little bit. Look at this. So all we're doing is I'm actually passing in an array of nav objects. And there's this key thing that I was just telling you about. So if you don't have a key, React gives you a little warning because React needs a way, because we're dynamically putting these on the page, and React needs a way to sort of track where they are on the page. And I'm just mapping over these. This is the other thing I forgot to mention, is that the second param you get with map is this index. And that can be really helpful. I just create a string and then append the index to it. But we're just mapping through, and let me show you. It's probably easier to even see the, yikes. This is so hard to see now.
Technically, there's a third argument, right?
Yes, yeah, there's multiple. And there's like this nav items array, and it's got a name and href, and it just pulls those out. And so if you click on these, it will take you to that href. And kind of the nice thing about this, and I know like Angular and Vue have these kinds of things, but I really prefer the way React does it. So if I add a name and I say clubs, and we add some href. Doesn't really matter what it is. It's clubs. Right. It dynamically go so you can see it a little bit better. And it added this clubs thing over here, right? So it's just cycling through that array and dynamically generating those. And even I mentioned the select before. So here there's a bunch of stuff. So we've got a select. We've got some dynamic stuff happening there, but we're just cycling through these clubs. And it takes the text and the value just like most do. And also, so this just takes this array. It's got a value, it's got text, and then depending on what you choose, that's the crest it shows. So like Chelsea, it shows a Chelsea crest. I'm also doing another map here. Actually, no, that's the next example. But I am doing one I'll get to in a little bit called find. And find, well, I just want you to take a look at it. I'll get to it a little bit later. So I also
So it's the one on line 12 there?
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. Close that find. And find, well, I'll get to it, but it just returns one value from the array. Let me show you another one. I had one other.
As many as match returns.
And this is also
many that
a
match.
showcase of my awesome design skills. This is when did I click on the same one? No, I didn't. And so this is like an example of, and this is actually pulling from the IX trading API. So this is live data. And it just pulling out the company name. So these components are getting dynamically generated. And we're also cycling through the data. That was really what I wanted to show you. So we fetch some data from the API, and then we cycle through it and return those each stock. One other thing I want to point out, I'm using async await here, but I have to do, if you're wondering why I'm doing a promise.all, when you do an await of an array, it's actually returning an array of promises. So you also have to do an await promise.all because it's an array of promises. And then for each of those, for each of those stocks that come back, we're just dynamically rendering a stock component. So, and that's just some really simple, basically simple markup. And it pulls out the company name, latest price, and the PE ratio that you see here. So that's map. That's without taking up too much time because I fear I'll run out.
You're fine. Mark's not here. There's no rush.
The time Nazi's not here,
Yeah,
so I don't have to worry
he's
about it.
not. Erwin's got nowhere to go.
That's right. Yeah, I have no plans tonight, so.
And Mark sent me some tears, smile, and a thumbs up that says, "Oh, nice."
Oh, really? Nice. He's
I
taking it well.
sent him directly that photo.
The English take banter quite well, I have to say.
To a point. And then it gets real fucking ugly.
Yes. All right, so let's talk about reduce. Right, another fancy new hipster array method that was introduced way back in ES5. Reduce has some interesting rules for how it operates that we'll get into, but depending on certain params you give it, certain arguments you give it, it will start at different indices. Reduce has many uses. It's kind of a Swiss Army knife. It's also kind of why I don't particularly use it a lot. I had to kind of look for a good example for reduce because I've seen reduce used, abused too many times where you look at this big reduce function body and no idea what it's doing.
There's a great, pretty widely spread article. I don't know if you came across it when you were doing this, but it's how to recreate all the other array methods using just reduce. And I believe, we don't have anyone here from Digital Primates, but I believe Mike Labriola told me one time that that's part of their onboarding process. They make them do that.
Oh,
they
really?
Create all of the array methods, but you can only use reduce. Create all the results that you would get from map and for
wow.
each and reverse and sort and all that stuff.
That sounds terrible. That sounds awful. Yeah, it's funny you say that because there was MDN had one where it was flatten an array of arrays. So you reduce and then you concat, and I was like, there's got to be a way to do it without using.
Well, you can do that in one line now. It's in spread and
yeah, exactly.
a new set to make sure it's unique and
right. So here's a simple reduce. So the part of the problem I think with reduce is almost all of the examples you see are like this. So of course I'm going to start you with it. Apparently REPL is updating while I'm giving this presentation.
been
I
wondering
really
why
wish you
I
would
thought
click
you
on
were
that, 'cause
afraid
my
to click on
OCD is
it.
giving me a lot of trouble with
Is it? I'm just going to leave it just to torture me. You shouldn't have said that. I'm not a nice person.
All right.
So here's a reduce. So reduce also, it's going to iterate through the array. We'll get to some of those weird things about the index that it starts and that it starts on essentially. So this is an incorrectly summed array. I'm also not logging anything. That's why, but we're still going to get undefined. So we get undefined. Question to the class. So does anybody know why we're getting undefined? So essentially what this is doing is it goes through and it adds, and that'll lead us right into accumulator and current element.
Because accumulator doesn't exist.
It's not initialized.
It's not initialized. Accumulator doesn't exist. Well, I'm not returning it, exactly. So I know, but that's why this is something that as I was doing this presentation, it helped me understand reduce. So we're not returning anything. So I even have some notes here. Reduce takes 4 different params, but generally people usually only use the first, which is a callback, which is right here. And those of you who are not JavaScript developers, maybe you're Java or C#, should still recognize, in C# it's a lambda, I don't know what they call it in Java.
Just to be fair, if you didn't have those brackets.
Yeah, it also is very confusing. Right, that's true, yes, you're exactly right, Joe. So yeah, before, to Joe's point before I move on, before, in my previous examples, I just had an arrow pointing to some item, right? And it's a concise arrow with an implicit return. So this is a non-concise arrow because it's just an anonymous function with an arrow, and then there's a function body. So just to elaborate on Joe's point. So, okay, so the first parameter of reduce is I'm giving it a function, right? Everybody hopefully is clear on that. And then that callback, you get some stuff. So like just as you did in map, that callback got some things. It got the actual array element, and then it also got the index of the element. In reduce, you get this thing called an accumulator. And so the reason why this doesn't work is the accumulator is either this second thing that I'm going to get to, another parameter we'll get to, or if you don't provide that, the accumulator is always going to be the return value of the previous iteration. So as we go through, and I'll show you this in a working example.
Look at that, cake in the oven.
Oh, I think I'm going to have to reload. REPL does this sometimes. Damn it.
Oh,
Steve
demo
Schwartz
gods be
wins.
Nice.
There you go, Steve.
My stress level is much lower now.
That is playing with fire there, brother.
I know. Right, so we get 15. Am I in the right one? Okay, here we go. And so the reason is we're returning, right? So that array up there, it was just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it went through and it added the accumulator of the current element and then returned it. And so what that means is, and this was the thing, so I'm going to cover these two things in one. I hope it's not confusing. And let me bring this up. I actually had it in the slide. So here's the thing. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't get to this yet, but I mentioned there's a second parameter that reduce takes, and it's called the initial value. And so the initial value, if it's not provided, reduce uses the first, it starts at index 0 and index 1, and index 0 essentially becomes the accumulator. So in that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 array, go back to it, what's actually happening, is it's starting here, and this is the accumulator. And so it adds them, and it's 3, and then it returns it. So coming here, the accumulator is 3, right? Accumulator is 3, and then it adds a 3, so it's 6. And so once it's returned, the accumulator basically keeps getting overwritten. So the accumulator is whatever the return value is of the previous iteration. Get rid of this. And I think it'll make a little bit more sense with this example. So this was, Joe, do you know Shane Osborne at all?
Of course.
So he had a really good example on this. So I basically stole his example and modified it with English football clubs.
Can you? I think before the files weren't on the screen. Like I'm
Oh,
just wondering
yeah.
if you can gain a little more space.
Yeah. There we go. So here's what we're doing. So I've got an array of strings that represent the club names, right? And what I want to do is I want to take this this array of strings and I want to count. So let's say these are like votes. We put out a vote for favorite clubs, and each of these is a vote. And this is a really nice, concise way to sort of sum them. And so what we're going to do is, so here's our callback to reduce. And then I've got this extra thing here, which is the initial value. And I'm just passing in an object. And so what's going to happen is we're going to come in, and the first time it's going to run, getting my steps in this top It's gonna come through, and it's gonna find Newcastle United, right? That's gonna be the thing. And remember, there was that rule I just showed you from MDN that said if initial value isn't provided, reduce will execute the callback function starting at index 1, right? Which is what I was just saying about those numbers. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it starts at index 1, which was number 2. And 1, trying not to make this confusing, 1, which is at index 0, is the accumulator, right? So it starts at index 1, which was the number 2. I should have used a much better array. I should use like ABCD or something. But those wouldn't have summed.
Deep breath.
I know, deep breath. And but with this example, what it's saying is because we're passing in an initial value, it's starting at index 0. It's starting the iteration at index 0, and the accumulator is an empty object. So what it's going to do is it's going to come through, and this is actually just doing some very simple stuff. So it just looks to see, does the accumulator have a property called Newcastle United? And if it does, then it adds it adds 1. So we've got now we've got an object that has a Newcastle United property with 1. And if it doesn't, then it just creates the property and assigns 1 to it. And so let's run this. And this was also taking the piss out of Mark because Sunderland got more votes than Newcastle. So there's all these little passive-aggressive ways I can get at him. And so what we end up with is like a tally of the elements in that the string elements in that array. So yeah, and that's I think yes.
What helped me understand reduce, because I'm like slow, is I put like console log, and I'd always log out the accumulator and the current element and let it run, and then you're like, oh,
yeah, that's a good
I
idea.
see what's going on. This iteration, I've got one thing. The next iteration,
exactly.
I've got 2 and 3 and 4 and 5.
And the other thing to note about this, I mean,
That made it easier for me to understand.
to show you that the accumulator is always going to be, yeah. So if we do this, at the end we get
Ta-da.
accumulator, and the reason for that is that it comes through, but it's not actually returning the object, it's just returning the string accumulator, and it comes through, and so your actual reduced value, once it's done, is just the result of that final iteration. No matter what you've done, the reduced value will be the result of that final iteration of going through the array. But that's also a good idea too. So I think if you have questions about that, please let's get to those after. I think I'm probably running out of time. Filter. So, and these will take a lot less because they're a little more straightforward. So filter, also a race prototype filter. I believe it's also ES5. I think I took those out because I was like, I'm kind of beating a dead horse here. So filter takes a predicate, and I'm going to zoom in on that, returns a new array, so it's also immutable, of elements that match the criteria specified in the predicate. It is used in React, but it's probably most commonly used. I just got an alert, I'm on call. Not actually an alert, just a message. But it's also, I mean, I most commonly used it in Redux. I haven't done a lot of Redux in the last couple of years because...
Well, you use it if you're just filtering a list.
Yeah,
I mean,
definitely.
very easily. Yeah.
Definitely. So let's drill on that predicate thing. So, and this is, I like this because it helps me in my brain understand sort of the difference between the previous two array methods and these next two. So, and this was basically the Visual Studio Code. It even shows you, this was from Fine, so I'm cheating a little bit, but predicate. And this was the best definition I found. Predicates are often found in the form of callbacks, but in general we can use the term for any function that returns a bool based on evaluation of the truth of an assertion. And so what that means is that in a filter, so this is like a Redux reducer. This is a predicate. So the function in the callback in a filter or a find is going to be a predicate. and it's just going to evaluate to true or false. So what this is saying is return any of the items in this array that in this state array. So those are your Redux. I don't know where I'm coming from with this. Return the items that are not the current org ID, that are objects that don't match the current org ID. And then I'm also sort of immutably creating a new object. But the point being, and this is another good example, it's just, it goes through the array, so it goes through this state.list, and it filters and it goes through the array, and it's like, does it match it? Okay, good, put it in the array. If it doesn't go in the array. And this is in a set state, so those of you new to React, also this is something to take note of. The set state thing is very important in React. And like Joe said, this is just a good way of sort of filtering stuff out of a list. And then
at the core of that, it just because I feel like you're rushing yourself and you don't need to. At the core of that, inside the callback body of the filter method, if it returns true, it's a part of the new array. If it returns false, then it's not.
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. No, that's important to point out. So if you did everybody hear Joe about that? So if it evaluates to true, if the current element matches the criteria in the callback, it gets included in the new array. And it's a new array, right? So it's immutable because we're not modifying the previous array. And if it doesn't match that criteria, it gets thrown out essentially. And then find, which I showed you a little bit before, it also takes a predicate and it returns the exact item. And this is one of those things where when you work at different places, different development shops have like kind of methods that they like to use. I hadn't really used find very much, and I'm glad we do. So at the post this is just for some reason one array method we use a lot. And in the past I had used filter actually for like filtering and grabbing one value, but it kind of doesn't really make sense to do that because if you filter is giving you an array, I'd get an array of like one object and then I'd have to like do a 0 to get the only thing in the array. But it's a great all-purpose method for if you need to get one thing out of an array. So let's go to here. Oh, I have more. Oh, I included a. So again, we've got an array of clubs, English clubs, and
The lowly clubs.
oh, there's a filter. Sorry, I had too many examples.
More.
Here we go.
More examples.
So, but I do need those clubs. Okay, so we've got all these clubs. There's Mark's. And so, and this was actually me being nice to him because Newcastle's owner sucks. So they have a very loyal fan base. So our constant here is the club whose owner sucks but is supported by good and loyal supporters. So this was my olive branch after taking the piss, basically this whole talk out of him. And we're doing clubs.find, and we're taking a predicate, right? So we're going to search in the array, and if we find the club that has the name Newcastle United, we're going to get that individual object.
And only that object, right?
And
If there was
only
a
that
second
object.
one, you would still only get the first one, is that right?
What's that?
If there was a second one that had the same name, you would still only get the first one.
That's
I
a
believe.
good question, Joe.
I believe
I
that's true.
think that's true, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Filter
so-
would be a better use case if you thought there was going to be more than one.
Right,
Whereas
yeah.
find is going to give you one item.
Exactly. Exactly. That's why you run. That's why you run conferences, because you know what you're talking about.
That's why I invite good speakers.
So yeah, so that's actually a really great distinction. If you didn't hear what Joe was saying, so this is for getting one and the first thing that matches the criteria. But if you wanted like all clubs, I mean you wouldn't have more than one club with Newcastle United. But let's say you had some instance where you wanted multiples that match it, that would also be a great filter use case. So we're just going through, and then we get that object. And that's it. Questions? Steve Schwartz.
Could you run the reduce with a console log in there for me? That'd make me really happy.
It wasn't a question.
That is
it was
technically
a
a
request.
question. Technically true.
I asked. He could have told me to get lost. But he's
I would
nice.
never
No,
do
but
that.
you were
He's a
so
nice
passive
guy.
aggressive.
I would never
about
do
it.
that to you, Steve.
You said, you know what else helps is if you do a console log in there, and he was like, "That is a good idea, Steve," and he moved on. Your little passive aggressive heart broke. You're like, I meant to do it.
So that the one with the votes, Steve, is that the one?
I
And
think
then
that was a
did you-
good one. Because
that was the one that you-
And then should I console log the accumulator?
I would log the accumulator and the current element. That way you can see each step.
Sure.
And you should
'Cause they're-
probably
for the really
return the proper accumulator.
Oh yeah, no, it's broken.
Otherwise, it's just going to say accumulator, accumulator, accumulator.
Oh yeah. Actually, since we're, I guess technically, we don't really care what the return value is, but.
Oh, it won't do anything.
Oh, where'd my?
Because the really complicated ones I have to do this when you're trying to figure out someone else's code.
Every once in a while, yeah.
Doesn't do an example.
It actually does.
Does it?
Yeah. Let's
I should
see.
reload it.
Oh man, you're going to have to console log a bunch of asterisks.
I know. Yeah, good point. Good point.
This is where we need
Here I
that,
can
how
do
to
the,
use debugging talk. Where we all expose the fact that we console log debug.
I still need it's so bad. Okay, so here we go. So I should have done the element. So the accumulator. It's interesting that. Oh, it's because I'm doing it first. That's why. What I should be doing is this. And I'll add elements. There we go. Okay, that'll be cleaner. Yeah, so we get Newcastle, it adds it. Chelsea, it adds it. We get Man City, it adds it. We get Sunderland, adds it. We get Newcastle again, adds it. Yeah, that's a really good idea, Steve. So if you are like me and Steve, and maybe reduced didn't come real intuitively to you, that's a really nice little hack to sort of help you kind of get your brain around what's happening.
So just to throw out there, I know each time you went through the first two, and then you stopped like driving it home, that these things have been around since ES5.
Yeah.
Technically, these things were around before ES5.
Right.
They were just we didn't have like the proper TC39 structure that we have now. I think it existed, but we didn't have like the stages that exist now. So you just had a whole bunch of people writing polyfills for methods that they wanted. So reduce and fold and a whole bunch of ones that didn't make the cut definitely existed, and eventually kind of ended up in underscore back in the day.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Long before we even really hit ES5. And then these types of libraries, along with later CoffeeScript and then now TypeScript, these things informed future versions of JavaScript, and we certainly see that a lot now. Except now it's a much more transparent process, and we have tools like Babel to let us just jump right in, and we don't need some like one-off library to prove it. We can just fuck around with it now.
Right. Especially given how big Lodash and underscore sometimes got.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's not like everything from back in the day made it in. There's still a ton of all that stuff made into RxJS.
Oh,
If you go to RxJS,
there's a big
every operator you ever imagined is in that thing, and it's growing like endlessly and nonstop. But these things were around in the if no one knows, there is no ES4. Like that doesn't exist. There was an E4X that never happened, and that's where JSX was born.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, a form of JSX was born in E4X, but there was no ES4. So, like from ES3, which is like I don't know, IE 5.5 maybe, like back in the day there, some early Netscape stuff, there's just this huge chasm of nothing happening with JavaScript. So but you can extend anything in JavaScript you like. Like you can just create these methods yourself. As long as you could do it in JavaScript, you can just create a new array prototype method. And so that's what people did.
Right.
And it was painful, but it got us to where we are now.
True. Yeah, like we could, for those of you who don't maybe know what Joe's saying, I could even do like array.prototype.
I used to have a reverse for each.
Equals, yeah. Hello.
Is that going to work?
And then
it does.
It works. So we just overrode. So like Joe said, one of the things that's feature or bug is that JavaScript is you can override it very easily. And I would say, for the most part, anybody who had to do any kind of significant polyfilling, it was a pretty nice feature.
Oh,
You weren't just totally, those of us who were like in closed systems like C# or some of those others, you were just, you got what you got, and anything you wanted to add to it, you had to come up with some kind of inline hack. So
Yeah, 90% of the proposals that you see in the TC39 they're written exactly like what you just did. Like, here's a new method. Like, what's the one that everyone got upset about? Flatten or flat map or it had a whole name. It was like Flatten Gate or something. It was a big like controversy. What we're going to name this thing? But it's literally what you just wrote. Like array prototype. Here's a new thing we would like to do, and here's what it's a shortcut for in JavaScript. Like we could almost everything that's shown up in JavaScript, with the exception of symbols and maybe generators. Is all like you could do it in JavaScript. There was a way to prove, and you could just write it on the prototype, and then the proposal is like, just make this let's not have to hack this together. Sorry, I don't mean that.
Yeah, no worries. Not as bad as the, did you see they had a thing, a little off topic here, but they had a thing where they recommended semicolons, and like a bunch of people who don't use semicolons like were flipping out. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, it has semicolons whether you put them in there or not. Automatic semicolon insertion is a thing. So, any other questions anybody has?
I have one. For the default object there, could you put something, let's say you didn't find anything in your reduce, it would spill that one out? Could you put a real object in there instead of just an empty object?
Oh yeah.
You mean like with some properties and stuff?
Yeah, just like, whatever you reduced didn't find, anything, it would that would be the default, literally the default object that would come out as a return.
Yep.
But it would also be added in, though.
It would?
Yeah, it would accumulate. It's not for else, like some languages have, where if it doesn't go through the loop, return this. It would accumulate.
So if you started that off with like A is 1, then what you're going to get is the exact object he had in the end, but it will also have the A1, because that will still persist.
Right.
Yeah.
It's accumulated, okay.
But if inside of that, like he didn't find anything to add to that initial object, then you would just get the initial object back.
All right.
Yeah.
And
so you could have a complicated object, but you wanted to verify that you had at least certain elements.
That is a super common use case, especially in React development. But I think in all like kind of modern advanced JavaScript development right now is where you start off with an object and you're basically using reduce to figure out like how I need to extend that object or which fields I need to update, and if not, let it go. Right, but then again, a lot of that gets reduced to just 3 dots now.
Right, exactly. Because what would happen if I didn't pass in the initial value? Does anybody know?
It'll take the first one.
Let me get rid of my console logs here.
And if you still have that prototype.
So we just get the first thing, right? Because it's the accumulator. And because remember the index rules? So the accumulator gets set to the first index, which is index 0. And index 0 was Newcastle United. And then it would go through, and none of this makes sense because it's just a string, not an object. I mean, we could have an argument about whether everything is an object in JavaScript, but it's going to go through a string, and it's not going to find this part isn't really going to make any sense. So it's just going to keep returning the initial accumulator.
to throw in a console logs typo and find out why the hell it wasn't working.
Yeah. And then you realize you did
And then you would
something
get
stupid.
object, and then you'd
So what
start
do you
looking
mean
for
it's
instance of.
Right. Yeah. So that's why we have it. Anybody else? Final questions? All right. Thank you.
Cool, thank you.